for tonight. We're in the final main section of the book of Genesis here, which goes from chapter 46 through to the end of the book in chapter 50. And what we've seen in this section is the move of Jacob and his family into Egypt, which we looked at last week in chapter 46 and in the beginning of chapter 47, with the settlement of Jacob and his family in the land of Goshen, the meeting that Joseph had with his father, them being reunited after all those years apart, and then the meeting that Jacob had with Pharaoh and the conversation he had with Pharaoh and the invitation from Pharaoh for them to stay in the land. And that's where we finished at verse 12 of chapter 47. The account continues with Jacob's final days in Egypt and his death. And then finally in the book, we'll have the death of Joseph himself. So this is where we're heading in this final section. So in chapter 47 now, in verses 26, we have an account of Joseph's policies for famine relief, which show him to be a skilled and wise administrator whose work brought great benefit to Pharaoh and brought food for the people as well. So read the account here, chapter 47 from verse 13 down to verse 26, which says, "Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, 'Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone.' And Joseph answered, 'Give your cattle, and I will give you food in exchange for your cattle if your money is gone.' So they brought their cattle to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the asses, and he supplied them with food in exchange for all their cattle that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, 'We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the herds of cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate.' So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe upon them. The land became Pharaoh's, and as for the people, he made slaves of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, 'Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones.' And they said, 'You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh.' So Joseph made a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth, and the land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's." So we see here the policy that Joseph introduced at this time of famine. The famine was so great in the land of Egypt and Canaan that the people had now spent all of their money on grain. And now we're a few years, probably about 4 or 5 years into this 7-year famine. So the money has all been spent on grain, and Joseph paid that money received from the sale of the grain into Pharaoh's treasury. And now, with all of their money gone, the people appealed to Joseph for food so that they might not die before his eyes, they say. And Joseph proposed to them that since they had no money now, that they should that he would give them food in exchange for their animals, their horses, their flocks, their herds, their asses, and the cattle. And so that's what happened. They exchanged the animals for food. And then the following year, the people came again to Joseph for help. Now they have no money, and their cattle have already been given to Joseph. And what they say is that all they have left now are themselves and their land. And so they offered to give their land and themselves as slaves to Pharaoh in exchange for food, so that they might not die. Things have come to an extreme set of circumstances here. And so in this way, then, Joseph acquired all of the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and the people themselves became Pharaoh's slaves. Or it might be that we would call them Pharaoh's tenants. Pharaoh owned the land now. He was the freeholder, and they were working on the land there that belonged to Pharaoh. The Authorized Version has a slightly different translation there. Rather than saying that they were slaves, it says that he removed them to the cities, which might suggest that Joseph took the people from the land into the cities in order to perhaps feed them there. So there's a variation in some of the translations on that. The only land that Joseph did not buy was that which belonged to the priests. The priests were a powerful class in Egypt, and we're told here that they were paid an allowance by Pharaoh, which they lived on. So this was a state-sponsored religion. And there are documents or writings outside of the Bible which confirm this sort of arrangement, that the power of the priests and this allowance that they would receive from the Pharaoh. Joseph then provided the people with seed for them to sow. In verse 23 mentions the seed, and the provision of the seed for sowing would be an indication that the famine is now soon to be over, that they'll be able to sow the seed and the following year reap the crops. And when that happened, the people were to pay 1/5, 20% of their harvest to Pharaoh in sort of form of taxation, whilst they would keep 4/5 or 80% for themselves, for them to use as food for their families, and also some of that would be to use as seed to plant for the following year's crop. So the people accepted these terms, acknowledging that Joseph had saved their lives. And we're told here that the end of that reading there in verse 24 and 25 and into 26, that Joseph had made this into a statute, a legal statute, that Pharaoh would have 1/5 of the harvest, whilst the land belonging to the priests would be exempt from paying anything to Pharaoh. And in verse 26, we're told that that statute was still in force when this account here in Genesis was being compiled. The verse says there, it stands to this day. So whenever this account was compiled, if that was by Moses, then it was still something that was in effect at that time. It would be that 20% tax from their harvest to Pharaoh. Although Joseph's actions here may seem somewhat severe to us today, he was acting in accordance with the social and political norms of his time, and he was probably acting more graciously than others would have done. And Joseph's actions certainly saved the lives of the people of Egypt, and the people acknowledged that. And they say to him in verse 25, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh." So they express that willingness, their gratitude that through Joseph's policies, their lives had been saved. At the same time, this policy increased Pharaoh's wealth and increased his power in Egypt as well. That Pharaoh was now had all of the land was his, and the people were tenants on his land, in effect. So that's the account there that we have of the land policies of Joseph at that time. If we move on now, we pick up a story concerning Jacob. He comes back into the story now from verse 27. So we will read verse 27 to verse 31 of Genesis chapter 47. Thus Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal loyally and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." He answered, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So during the final years of the famine, then Israel was living in the land of Goshen, as we saw last week, where they had arrived, and they prospered in that land. They gained in possessions and they increased greatly in number. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years, and he would die at the age of 147. In verse 9, as we noted last week in his meeting with Pharaoh, when Pharaoh asks him how old he is, Jacob says he's 130 years old. So he was 130 when he came into Egypt, and he'll be there for 17 years before his death. So now when the time of his death has come near, so we've moved on perhaps almost 17 years now, it's near to the time of his death, so almost 17 years, he called Joseph to him. And Jacob asked Joseph to swear to him that he would not bury him in Egypt, but he says, "Let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." So Jacob did not want to be buried in Egypt. He wanted to be buried in the place where Abraham and Isaac, that's his father and his grandfather, were buried, and that was in the cave of Machpelah. That was the cave that Abraham had bought following the death of his wife Sarah, where she was buried, and then after Abraham's death, he was buried there too, and Isaac was buried there. So that's in the land that God had promised to give them. So Jacob wants his body to be taken back there. So Joseph agreed to this, and he swore to his father that he would do this for him. Jacob's request here that Joseph should put his hand under his thigh seems to be a custom practiced when confirming a promise or an oath. This was mentioned back in chapter 24 in verses 2 and 3. When Abraham sent his servants away to find a wife for Isaac, Genesis chapter 24, verse 2 says, "And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac." And verse 9 of that chapter goes on to say, "So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter." So this seems to have been some method by which an oath or swearing an oath would be confirmed. Perhaps today we might just shake someone's hand when making an agreement with someone, but things done a little bit differently there. So at that then, Israel or Jacob, names are used interchangeably for him here, we're told bowed himself upon the head of his bed, or some versions have the head of his staff. The New International Version translates this as Israel worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. The staff comes from the Greek version of the Hebrew a text which has staff rather than bed, and the two Hebrew words for bed and staff are very similar looking, so it could be either one there, but the Hebrew word is for bed. Although in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 21, which refers to this incident, uses the word staff here. Hebrews 11 verse 21, speaking of the faith of Jacob, which says, by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. So whether it's his bed or his staff, we can't be 100% sure. So moving on then into chapter 48 now, we have Jacob pronouncing this blessing upon Joseph's sons. And Joseph, first of all, visits his sick father in verses 1 to 7. It says, after this, Joseph was told, behold, your father is ill. So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, your son Joseph has come to you. Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the offspring born to you after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. For when I came from Paddan, Rachel, to my sorrow, died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So Joseph was informed that his father was very ill. So there's some time gap between the end of chapter 47 and the beginning of chapter 48. We don't know how long, but Jacob is ill, and so Joseph is informed, and he takes his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him to visit his dying father. Jacob managed to summon up his strength to sit up in his bed and to speak to Joseph. And he recalled the time when God Almighty, he refers to God here, uses the name God Almighty, which is El Shaddai. He recalled the time when El Shaddai had appeared and had spoken to him at Luz. And Luz was the earlier name of Bethel, which Jacob gave it the place Bethel, in the land of Canaan. There were two occasions when this happened, when God spoke to him there. The first was in Genesis chapter 28, when Jacob had left home after the argument with Esau, and he's been sent away to his uncle Laban. And on the way there, he comes to this place, Luz, and he goes to sleep and has the dream in which he sees the ladder going up into heaven, angels ascending and descending on the ladder, and God speaking to him and giving him the promise and the reassurance there. So that was the first time God spoke to him, and that was when Jacob named the place Bethel. Verse 19 says he called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. And then the second time when God spoke to him at that same place is in chapter 35, Genesis, when Jacob comes back after those years away serving Laban, and he returns home. And verse 6 there says, Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan. And it was there again that God spoke to him on that occasion. So he's recalling this time in this conversation here with Joseph. And there at Bethel or Luz, God had blessed him and promised to make him fruitful and to make of him a great company of people who would be given the land as an everlasting possession. So this is, again, it's the repetition of the promise that God had originally given to Abraham concerning his descendants, making them into a great nation and giving them the land. Well, what Jacob does next here in this meeting with Joseph is quite interesting, because he then formally adopted Joseph's two sons who had been born in Egypt. That's Ephraim and Manasseh. The two sons would now be probably in their 20s. Jacob has been there 17 years. They were born before that time, so they're perhaps about 20 years old. So Jacob adopts them as his own sons. He says, as Reuben and Simeon were his sons, and Reuben and Simeon were his first two sons. So he is elevating the position of Ephraim and Manasseh, making them equivalent to his own sons. And then any subsequent children born to Joseph after the births of Ephraim and Manasseh would remain as Joseph's children. Ephraim and Manasseh would go on to become the heads of two tribes in Israel. Two tribes in Israel would be descendants of Ephraim and Manasseh. And what's happening here is that Jacob is elevating Joseph into the position of the firstborn by providing with this double inheritance that would come through Ephraim and Manasseh. So there wasn't one tribe of Joseph. There were two tribes descended from Joseph, which were his sons Manasseh and Ephraim. Jacob then recalls the death of Joseph's mother Rachel in the land of Canaan. He says when he returned from Padan, she was expecting her second child, Benjamin, and died in childbirth. And he speaks of her burial there on the way to Ephrath, which is earlier a name for Bethlehem. And he mentions there that Rachel's death had caused him sorrow. You remember that Rachel was his first love, the wife that he had wanted to marry first of all. Well, reading on here, verse 8 to 16 goes on to say, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, I pray you, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I had not thought to see your face, and lo, God has let me see your children also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand upon the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has led me all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and in them let my name be perpetuated, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." So when Israel saw Joseph's sons, and he asked, "Who are these?" And Joseph replied that they're his sons, whom God has given me here in Egypt. So Joseph acknowledged that it was God who had blessed him with these children. And Israel asked that they should be brought to him so that he may bless them. And we're told in verse 10 that in his old age, Israel's eyesight has deteriorated, and so he cannot see well. So Joseph brought his sons near to Israel, his father, so that he could kiss them and embrace them. And Israel then told Joseph that he had not expected to see his face. He thought that Joseph was dead, that he would never see him again. But now God has not only allowed him to see Joseph, but has also allowed him to see Joseph's sons, his grandsons. And Joseph then removed his sons from Israel's knees, and he bowed before him with his face to the earth in recognition and in respect of his father's position as head of the family. Joseph is this important man in Egypt, but he still has respect for his father and bows before him. And Joseph then took his two sons towards Israel for them to be blessed, and he would bless them by placing his hands on their heads. It's interesting, the detail that's given here, that Ephraim was in Joseph's right hand, facing Israel's left hand, whilst Manasseh was in Joseph's left hand, facing Israel's right hand. So he's leading them face on towards Jacob, his father. And so that in that case, Israel would naturally place his right hand on the head of Manasseh, who is the firstborn. However, what we're told is that Israel crossed his hands over and placed his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, who was the younger son, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, who was the firstborn. And so he was bestowing here the blessing of the firstborn on the younger son. And Israel then pronounced this blessing upon Joseph and his sons, and he asks that God should bless the lads, and that in them his name may be perpetuated along with the names of Abraham and Isaac, and that they would grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Again, that verse we read earlier in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, sees this as an example of Jacob's faith when he blesses the sons, that by faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph. So that was an expression of his faith, that God would keep that promise that he had made. Israel speaks here of God as being the God before whom Abraham and Isaac had walked, and also the God who had led him like a shepherd all his life long. So the New International Version translates this as the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, which is a lovely picture, really, of God being the shepherd, the one who's been leading him all of his life long for these 147 years that he has lived. And also as the angel who has redeemed him from all evil. And God had appeared and spoke to Israel as the angel of God, or the angel of the Lord, and God had protected him during that time. So looking back over his life, Israel acknowledged just how God had helped him and how God had delivered him from trouble during his lifetime. Well, verses 17 to 22 now goes on to say this: when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand upon his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh." And thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you, and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope, which I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow." So when Joseph saw that Israel had placed his right hand on the head of the younger son Ephraim, he was displeased, and he attempted to remove Jacob's hand and place it on Manasseh's head instead. Manasseh was the firstborn, and so Israel, Joseph thinks, should be placing his right hand on his head. But Israel refused to do so. He tells Joseph, I know what I'm doing. And he told Joseph that Manasseh would also become a great people, that his younger brother Ephraim would be greater, and his descendants would become a multitude of nations. And then he continued to bless them both by saying, by you, Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God, make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. So their names would be used in Israel as an expression of blessing, that Ephraim and Manasseh would be regarded as privileged or blessed people. And so may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh would be a saying. May God bless you in the same way as he has blessed them. And in this way, then, Israel gave Ephraim the priority, or put him into the position of the firstborn. In 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, there is a reference to this, what's going on here, really. This is referring to Reuben, who was Israel's first. This is 1 Chronicles chapter 5 from verse 1, speaking of Reuben, who was Jacob's firstborn, but lost that position, as we read here. The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, but because he polluted his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he is not enrolled in the genealogy according to the birthright. So we see there that the birthright, the position of the firstborn of Jacob, went to the sons of Joseph rather than to Reuben. Verse 2 says, though Judah became strong among his brothers, and a prince was from him, and Judah was the tribe from the royal family. David was from Judah, so that's the royal family tribe. But even so, he says, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. So that's an interesting insight there on all of this, that it's the change of that position of the firstborn going from Reuben to Joseph, to Joseph's sons. Israel then spoke to Joseph again about his forthcoming death, and he tells Joseph that although he is soon to die, God will still be with Joseph and would bring him again to the land of his fathers, back to the land of Canaan. And so this would give hope to Joseph and to all of the descendants of Israel during the years of hardship that are to come, in that time when they would be enslaved there in Egypt. So they would always have this in the back of their minds, that there was this hope that one day they would be set free. And then in addition, Israel tells Joseph that he has given him, instead of his brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. Or one portion is a word that's used in some versions. The word used here means shoulder. It's the Hebrew word Shechem, and that was the name of the place as well, Shechem. It means shoulder or portion. There's no account of this actually happening, of Jacob taking this land, this mountain slope, with his sword and with his bow. There is an account of Jacob buying some land at Shechem, which is back in chapter 33, verses 18 to 20, which says that Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. So there's some land that was bought there, but there's no account of him taking by force with sword and bow a mountain slope in that area. Or maybe it's the same piece of land. Maybe he lost the land and had to reclaim it in that way, or but we can't be sure. It's interesting, there's a mention of this piece of land in the Gospel of John, in John chapter 4 and verse 5, when Jesus was traveling through Samaria and he came to Sychar there. Told there that Jesus had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. So there's that field there mentioned that Jacob gave to Joseph. It was still known as that place that Jacob had given to Joseph in the time of Jesus as well. The tribe of Ephraim did become one of the dominant, the powerful tribes in Israel. Joshua was from the tribe of Ephraim. Then after the division of the kingdom, following the death of King Solomon, when the kingdom divided, the northern kingdom of Israel was known by the name Ephraim, the one tribe, although there were 10 tribes. Ephraim was one of the 10 tribes, but all of them collectively in that northern kingdom were sometimes referred to as Ephraim, so the part being put for the whole there. And Jeroboam, who was the first king of the northern kingdom after the division, he also was from the tribe of Ephraim as well. So we're sort of gaining a bit of background information here in Genesis about things that will happen later on in Israel's history as well. But it's interesting to see here what Jacob does with regard to Joseph's sons and the way that he elevates them and makes that blessing upon Ephraim as well. There's a few things we might think about from this then. How is God continuing to fulfill his promise to Abraham? That promise which was given way back in Genesis chapter 12, that promise is still in the process of being fulfilled here. And then what promises is God fulfilling in our lives? How does God fulfill the promises that he makes to us today as well? What preparations did Jacob make for his death? And how should we prepare for our own death? A few things perhaps to think about there. We'll stop here for this evening.